The Mekong River is a food basket for the world. It feeds tens of millions of people in mainland Southeast Asia. The food, the rice, the fish, the shrimp that are produced there get exported all over Asia, and they make their way to the supermarkets in the United States. So you will not find a supermarket without a product from the Mekong region. It's one of the most productive and impressive river systems in the world.
How is water security in one region a global issue?
The Mekong River runs from China all the way through five countries downstream in Southeast Asia, a portion of Myanmar, most of Laos, some of Thailand, most of Cambodia, and then goes into the ocean in Vietnam's Mekong Delta. And that Mekong Delta particularly is important for global food production. In the United States, most of the markets that you go to, the supermarkets, and not just the Asian markets, like H Mart or Latte, nearly all the supermarkets and all the cities and towns of the United States have fish or rice or some product from the Mekong Delta. And that productivity of Vietnam's Mekong Delta is being threatened by a lot of changes being introduced to the Mekong Basin.
What factors threaten water security in the Mekong region?
So just to look at the importance of what comes from the Mekong River for the people of the Mekong, because I think that's the most important priority to emphasize, that tens of millions of people rely on natural resources, fish, water, agricultural productivity that's provided by the Mekong's flood pulse. So that means during the wet season, there's a lot of seasonal inundation or flooding, good flooding, productive flooding, not the kind of flooding that we saw, say, brought by Hurricane Helene and Asheville, but just normal month-long flooding that provides water throughout the year and creates the conditions for making the Mekong, say, the world's largest fishery for freshwater fish, responsible for 20% of the world's freshwater fish production. And again, that fish production feeds the people of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and others. That flood pulse is being threatened by both some changes in climate patterns. We're seeing that wet seasons are less wet. They are more intense. So the Mekong is getting rain and storms like we saw with, say, Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton here this year. But at the same time, there's just less precipitation overall, and that's changing the nature of that flood pulse. And then upstream dams, they're also having an effect. And there are a lot of dams now, over 700 of them, some large, some small, but they also have an effect on bringing down the flood pulse during the wet season, and that reduces the seasonal inundation or the seasonal flooding. There are other factors, but these are the two big ones, that the climate is changing and dams are delivering their impacts in a negative way.
Are the issues that face the Mekong unique?
Well, the Mekong is unique because of its flood pulse. A lot of rivers have flood pulse systems, but the Mekong has the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest lake in Southeast Asia that normally feeds into the Mekong mainstream via a river. The connection happens at Phnom Penh in Cambodia. But during the wet season, when that flood pulse is happening, that heartbeat of the Mekong is happening, the river that normally feeds into the Mekong mainstream from that lake reverses direction, and it pushes water back up into that lake, causing it to expand 5 times its normal size. And 60 times the amount of water that's in there during the dry season goes in during the wet season. It's an amazing thing, and it's a miracle of the Mekong. It's really what makes the river system unique. And that expansion or that heartbeat that you can see on satellite mapping, and people there see it very clearly. They live on stilted homes so that they can have livelihoods and exist and adapt to their surroundings during the wet season to see the waters rise and fall. That's what produces the Mekong's mighty fish catch. And then also when that lake drains, it sends water down into the Mekong Delta to provide for irrigation during and into the dry season. So this is really unique for a river. Again, other rivers have these flood pulse effects, but nothing like that lake interaction and a huge floodplain that essentially makes up all of Cambodia and a significant portion of Vietnam.
What is the role of the United States and China in the Mekong region?
So saying that the United States is an ocean away, that's correct. China is not far removed from the Mekong. China is part of the Mekong. So the way that China acts in the Mekong and its portion of the Mekong River determines downstream outcomes. I would argue China is not invested in the health of the Mekong River. China's dams and the Mekong Dam Monitor, which I co-lead, shows very clearly how those dams are ruining the Mekong flood pulse. I mean, at times they can reduce the flood pulse by 20% all the way downstream during certain months. And that's a significant reduction. So China should be invested in the health of the river. China should be invested in Cambodia's food security and Vietnam's economic security for the Mekong Delta. But clearly it's not. And all the evidence shows that. The United States, on the contrary, is very much interested in supporting these ecological benefits that the Mekong provides to the downstream and supporting efforts which bring science and evidence to policymakers to demonstrate why it's important to preserve these ecological features like that flood pulse and like the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake. And that aligns well with the Mekong River Commission's position on the lower Mekong and floodplains. The Mekong River Commission is an intergovernmental body made up of member countries, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And their charter, the Mekong Agreement, prioritizes the health of that Tonle Sap Lake and the Mekong flood pulse. So all those countries are aligned. It would be great if China were more aligned with that particular position. But in fact, China runs in opposition to that position, which is unfortunate. However, in recent years, there's been a lot more dialogue between the downstream countries and the upstream in supporting the joint operations of the river. So that would be using dams together for joint purposes and priorities. Now, I hope that those conversations, which again, they're led by the downstream and China, I don't see a lot of external pushing and prodding to say, hey, this should happen from the outside. It is really a homegrown effort. I hope that those conversations can convince and bring evidence to the upstream that, say, the flood pulse is extremely important. But we haven't seen that yet. We have seen them talking about joint operations and more collaboration and more cooperation. Indeed, a good thing.
What can the United States and China do to keep the Mekong healthy?
Well, I think that US and China should have dialogues about the importance of the health of the river. There's a lot of changes coming from inside of China about how China's own domestic rivers and wetlands and floodplains are. We're seeing things like sponge cities being prioritized in China and floodplain restoration and nature-based solutions. I mean, these are all things that the US pushes in Southeast Asia and around the world too. So there is alignment there within China, potential alignment. But China's foreign policy to its neighbors or to, far-flung parts of the world does not reflect kind of the own internal changes that are happening within China itself. Maybe that will come someday. And perhaps the more dialogue between the US and China can be useful in influencing the way that China's environmentalists and China's scientists talk about the rest of the world.